Hello and welcome to Keeping It Social. My name is Chris Salas. I'm an assistant professor of social work here at EPCC and your host. This show aims to bring light to the social issues that impact our beloved city of El Paso. I will have guests on that will talk from where we were, where we are now, and where we potentially see our city going and these issues and how they impact our daily lives. This show does not aim at any particular political agenda or any one-sided affair. At the end of the day, our aim is to simply keep it social. Today we bring a guest in, a well-established guest in the El Paso community, in an attempt to talk about how things were back in the Paso del Norte time and to see how really some of these issues originated and potentially have we progressed, have we gone back, or where do we stand now in comparisons to how the El Paso and the Paso del Norte region has really progressed. So with us today is Mr. Bernie Sargent. Welcome, Bernie, to the show. How are you?
Thanks, Chris. Doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, thank you. First and foremost, thank you for your time and thank you for agreeing to be, as they say in Spanish, el padrino, right? The godfather of the show, being the first guest on the show.
It's a blessing. No, thank you. I appreciate that. It's quite an honor to be able to speak with people like yourself who really are kind of responsible for what the kids are learning now, kids of all ages. And having gone through education in California and El Paso and Arizona, where I went to school, I admire people that will pick up the pencil and start teaching. I shouldn't say pencil anymore, pick up the iPad and start teaching.
Yeah, quite different times, but hey, it's really what kind of brings us today, right? What brings us to the table today. And so being an expert, and I don't use that term lightly. I've looked over and have seen many of the shows that you have presented at and have spoken at, and I've seen your achievements, the list of accolades and achievements and even memberships that you have. So again, I don't use that term lightly. An expert in the heritage and culture of the Southwest, of West Texas and Southern New Mexico and the borderland. I wanted to bring you in so that we can have this conversation of back in the day, right, the Paso del Norte region and even before that. Mm-hmm. What were times like back then in regards to, we talk about social issues as being nowadays immigration, gun reform, education, things like food insecurity, housing. Obviously, some of those things were not necessarily an issue in that regard back in the Old West. But how were things in this particular region back in the Paso del Norte old times?
The precursor to where we're at today. Yeah, it's interesting we talk about that. A lot of what you were mentioning, they were issues, but on a much smaller scale. And when you talk about weapons control, things like that, weapons were necessary for food at the time. And whether it was bows and arrows or a blunderbuss or more efficient weapons that were designed over time. But if we go back in the days of when the tribes were living in the El Paso area, there were a handful of different tribes, and they all had their specialties with regards to ranching, farming, hunting, things like that. You had the Piros, you had the Manso, the Tiwas, and these were all before the Tiguas came back down here and after the revolt of 1680. And they kind of lived amongst themselves, and they more or less got along. There was not a whole lot of infringement. And most all of them were living somewhere on the south side of the Rio Grande River. Now, back in that time period, the Rio Grande River was further north than it is today. So when we look at where they lived, they could possibly have had some small clusters of clans living in the Keystone area, living in the areas around Concordia Cemetery, areas like that. So they were all over the place. And as time passed and as other tribes started to infiltrate West Texas and the Southwest, problems then started to arise that were creating situations. For instance, the Apache tribes, they were, because of their worship of Mother Earth, again, I wouldn't profess to be the expert on this, but from what I've read and heard, a lot of what they felt lived on Earth was theirs. It didn't belong to one specific tribe or so on. So that could create a lot of problems. And when the Spaniards were kind of settling along the southern side of the Rio Grande across from where you're at right now, there were problems with the Apaches infringing upon the Piros, Tiwas, Tiguas, and so on. And so the soldiers there made arrangements with the Apache tribes that they could set up sort of a quasi-reservation on the north side of the Rio Grande, which would be approximately where the ASARCO is, that facility, in that particular area on a rise. And the cluster was closer down to where Duranguito is today. You know, it's become quite a conversation in El Paso. And several folks, Dr. David Romo, for instance, did find proof when he was perusing through the records in Mexico City that the Mexican or Spanish forces would actually provide sustenance to the Apaches. In return, the Apaches would not infringe upon the other tribes in the area. So it kind of kept a peace amongst the groups of peoples that lived there at the time. And this was prior to the missions being established. You had the mother mission in Juarez, but you didn't have Socorro, Isleta, and San Elizario Presidio. So that was kind of an agreement they had. And honestly, from what I've heard, there was quite a bit of stir in the area whenever the Apaches would disappear. Well, they were going hunting, and that was their tradition. So they would head off into the mountains hunting. And so the soldiers would get a little bit concerned as to, are they going to have problems again? No, they would return again. And this happened a couple of seasons. As time progressed and people started to settle in the area, you had people like not Don Juan de Oñate, but the folks that were settling across the north side of the river that were establishing ranchos and orchards and so on. That's about the time that the Anglos started to move west into the West Texas and the 1850s and so on. And you had the settlements starting to grow within El Paso. And at that time, you had one small military base, which is approximately where the San Jacinto Plaza is in that particular area. That was the original Fort Bliss. It wasn't called it at that time. It was referred to as the post opposite of Paso del Norte. And that was established, again, to protect against the marauding tribes of the time, and also the uncertainty as to what was going to happen across the river after the United States purchased the land from Mexico. There was certainly a lot of animosity that was maintained on both sides of the river. And so they established a small military base. And that was a precursor to what we know now as Fort Bliss, Lenoria Mesa, the large military establishment that we have now.
So let me ask you a quick question, though, and this kind of also talks about, or in essence, builds on what my intent is for us to establish here. But you know, now we have this issue, right, where you have one group of individuals or another group of individuals, and there tends to be a conflict when the two groups, regardless of what the groups are, that integration, right? The integration of two groups.
Sure.
And so when you're talking about the different tribes that established here in the, in you know what we call now El Paso, but back then in the region, you're talking about the subsistence, or not the subsistence, in essence, how each particular tribe had their specialty in farming. So I'm guessing that there had to be some sort of amicable relationship between the two where there might be some bartering, but not necessarily some sort of integration between the tribes. Would that not be an accurate statement?
Well, again, from what I've read and heard people speak of, experts on that particular time period, the tribes, they tolerated each other more than integrated with each other. The story goes that a lot of the thought at the time is they could move all of the tribes into one area around one mission, one church, and everybody would be happy. And it didn't work out that way. Hence, they started to establish the other missions in the outlying areas, not just the ones we know of today in Mission Valley, but other missions that have long since disappeared. And that made a more palatable lifestyle for the tribes that didn't want to give up their tried and true practices, religious faith, food stuff, the way they harvested, those kinds of things. So that it made for a more amicable relationship throughout along the Rio Grande River. But again, it wasn't one where they said, "Oh yeah, we want to, let's all get along, let's just all tolerate." I think is what they were doing at the time. But as time progressed, they were kind of forced into commingling. You would have the Piro and the Manso tribes intermarrying, and you can see if you look at some of the generic studies that they've done on these families, how you go back 4 or 5 generations, and you can see the split where one was Piro, one was Manso, one might have been Tiwa. But they gradually, for economies of scale, for practicality, started to commingle, much like when the Europeans started settling on the East Coast, like my relatives, for instance. They moved in and they began to meld into the community, and they became Americans back there, or became Pennsylvanians where I was born. And the only time they would use their language is when they didn't want us grandkids to understand what they were talking about. But it was interesting how that progressed here on the border. And as the influx of Anglos from all around the world started showing up, not just the East Coast, but a lot of folks came in from Germany and came in from what was Russia at the time. They were migrating to get away from persecution, to get to an area where they could prosper. A lot of your Jewish merchants established their businesses first on the Juarez side, and then opened up on the El Paso side as things started to grow. And as El Paso grew, more and more of these merchants came over, and they would bring their relatives over. And you had a very strong influx of investment in this particular area because they saw opportunity. And with the proximity to Mexico, the proximity to the Rio Grande River, and the only 365-day-a-year route from east to west, north to south, this was the ideal place to start a business, to start a family, and to grow the community.
Again, a lot of the growth was, in essence, spurred by economics. Like you said, it became a hub. It became a great connection, as it continues to be, right? The connection, the Paso Del Norte, right? Granted, you have places like Presidio and San Diego now that have not necessarily, by volume, maybe larger ports of entry, but still El Paso would we consider the first major entry or passageway from Mexico to the United States, and thus promoting or pushing for that establishment, that economic growth. And you said, it really became an opportunity for people from all across the world to come in and find prosperity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and the growth was so incredible. Between the years of 1850 and 1890, it went from 300 people to 10,900 people living in El Paso. That's huge growth. And it just continued to spur. That was, 1,300% increase in growth. And along with that comes opportunity. But then along with that comes the ne'er-do-wells. And that's what kind of wrote the history of the Old West of El Paso. People, opportunists, not necessarily good opportunists, but opportunists nonetheless. And the growth of El Paso was such that the first federal bank opened up, our first federal bank branch opened up in El Paso because of the monetary exchange with Mexico and South America. There was so much money flowing north and south that they decided not only should Dallas be the headquarters for it, they should have an operation in El Paso. So all this was happening. And you went from an area in, for instance, 1881, when the first railroad came in through El Paso, where there were so many pool halls and so many saloons that we had the reputation. We were called Little Monaco or Hell Paso. They had all kinds of nicknames for this community. And again, it was the bad guys that came in that set up shop. And in 1850, we had one church in El Paso. And by the time 1882 came around, we had 5 churches, 5 denominations. And then in 1903, we had, I believe it was 19 churches with 11 denominations. So there was a need for religion to come into town. They saw a need. The very first Catholic church in El Paso was actually on the property that was owned by Hugh Stevenson, now Concordia. It was Rancho Concordia. And one of the problems that he saw and his wife saw, she was a Mexican that he had married, was that they would have to travel across the river to go to a Catholic service. So they set up a church on this side of the river, or I should on the north side of the river. And that was the very first one. And it lasted off and on for about 30 to 40 years. For a short period of time, it was the Roman Catholics said, you can't be a practicing Catholic church because you buried a Protestant there. And it was like, yeah. So there was this actual division amongst the religions too. And yet, when the Jewish faith started growing in this area, a lot had to do with the merchants I mentioned earlier. They saw a need for a temple. And all of the other churches got together and helped them build their first temple. So there was unification of the churches also. But within the churches, there was a little bit of separation. You know, if you go out to Concordia Cemetery, for instance, you would have at one period of time in the 1880s and 90s, you would have a Catholic citizen section and a Catholic non-citizen section. So they're actually segregating citizens from non-citizens. It was a very strange time, but we lived through it. We grew from it. And rather than say it never happened, it won't happen again, is I guess should be the mantra.
It's quite interesting that you were talking about the aspect of the flow from in essence the U.S. side to the Mexican side, and that going back and forth, but in the aspect of religion, right? In some aspect we still see that, right? When we have some families that are divided by the border, that maybe on the weekend they will go to Juarez or vice versa, so that they can join their family, be it at church services, be it after church services. But there is that flow back and forth, and
Yes.
And you bringing it up as it being, we typically see it as a commerce, right? An economic aspect of it, that the back and forth is economically driven, right? The shops along El Paso Street and along the bridges, that's where we see a lot of the movement. The malls, the stores, again, the economical driver, or being the economical driver. But we don't necessarily think about it in that aspect of religion or other aspects. And so to think about it in those terms, that even back in the late 1800s, we're seeing that flow, right? And I'm guessing we didn't have the immigration policy or the issues, maybe to the extent that we have now, but that you have people going back and forth so that they can practice their religion. And now we maybe continue seeing that, but we also see it as an economical growth, right? You'll go and buy your groceries in Juarez, or vice versa. People from Juarez will come and shop in U.S. malls. Maybe people that aren't insured in the U.S. will go to Juarez and get their dental or their medical needs taken care of. And so,
I've done it.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you kind of brought that up, that this flow between the two nations, not essence started with religion, but that was what spurred, one, the creation of a Catholic church or a denomination church here in El Paso, be it in Concordia, but also the back and forth that people who wanted to practice a certain religion found that in Juarez or across the border.
That's a good point. And I think that when we first moved to El Paso 35 years ago, well, actually 36 now, it was a very different environment going back and forth. And unfortunately, after 2001, with the situation that took place in New York, that changed everything. And it just continues to change. And now we've got a situation with all the folks from all over the world trying to come into the United States. It's put so much pressure on everyone on the border. And it's sad. I wish there was an amiable way to take care of that. And I wish they would do it soon. But going back to the old times of El Paso, it was an interesting place to live. We had segregation. I mean, there was very few blacks that lived in El Paso at the time, but they got along. Everybody got along. We did have a short period of time where the Ku Klux Klan rose up, and but they were eliminated. I mean, thank God they were eliminated, because it was just a ridiculous practice that they had. And so we've experienced virtually everything the rest of the country has experienced, but because of the location, it has taken longer to get there. And now with the technology being what it is, we're experiencing it instantaneously. And so it's changed that whole thing. I recently put together a little article story for the City Beat magazine on comparisons of what was going on in East Texas and what was going on in West Texas circa 1820. Because oftentimes people living in El Paso, they think that, okay, 1820, this is all that was happening in the world. There was a whole lot of things going on here in East Texas that I'm learning about. And it's an exciting opportunity to learn that and share that with the rest of my friends back in West Texas. So that's been kind of fun to do. But we had growing pains in East Texas also. You had a situation where the Mexican government had a constitution that welcomed people coming in from other parts of the world to settle the land. They had arrangements with these people to settle that land, that they did certain things, amongst which is practice Catholicism. If they did that, they would have access to that land. And then all of a sudden, the Constitution started to change to where they insisted you had to be a Catholic. They insisted that you had to pay taxes. All things that weren't in place initially. So they created a lot of animosities, not only with the Texians, or I should say the immigrants, but with the natives that lived here. They were getting very upset with the way that they were being treated by the Coahuila government, which was responsible for Texas at the time. That was considered all part of Coahuila at the time. And so we had problems here also, which were similar to what you're experiencing in West Texas or experienced in West Texas. It's fun to learn and it's fun to share. I'm just thank God that we're not doing it again. So it's just that kind of a world we're living in right now.
Going back to certain textbooks or even just books that I've read in the past, I recall looking at some images that in downtown El Paso, and again, I defer to you on this and to hopefully correct me if I'm wrong, but I recall seeing some images where they would have water fountains that and signs over water fountains that you would potentially see in the South, right, in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi, that said, in essence, blacks, dogs, and Mexicans through the back or in the back. And so that segregation, at least, well, not at least, but in our part of the world, in our part of Texas, also included the Mexicans, in essence, anyone of color.
Mm-hmm. It was more, I think the African Americans were singled out more strongly than the Mexicans were at that time period. There was in fact, a glass pane at the train depot that somebody washed off. But up until I think it was about 1989, I actually saw, you could see the outline. It said whites only. So yeah, and somebody washed it off, which was appropriate that they did that. But it did take place. Segregation in El Paso, in Texas, in the South, because Texas seceded from the Union, was dominant for a period of time. It definitely was. When they had the meeting in El Paso, Simeon Hart called a meeting, and his meeting was to decide whether they were going to join Texas in seceding or not. And only two people voted to stay with the Union, and that was the Mills brothers, Emmett Mills and W.W. Mills, or not Emmett Mills, but Anson Mills and W.W. Mills. They voted to stay. And after they voted, Hart stood up with a glass of champagne. He said, "A toast to the winners, hangman's noose to the losers." That's how strong and ironically, he was from Utica, New York. Here's a northerner living in El Paso, and he is siding with the Southerners and moving in that direction. Now, I found it pretty interesting when we were touring around some of the cemeteries. It sounds like a morbid thing to do, but it's very fascinating to learn history, and you can learn it by going to the cemeteries. There's one cemetery by Goliad, Texas, East Texas, and there's Confederate flags all over the place. 99% of the people buried there are Hispanic, are of Mexican descent. They served in the Confederacy. They served for the Confederate military. And there was a handful of African Americans at another cemetery that served in the Confederacy or for the Confederacy. So it was a strange time to live, but thankfully it's gone, and we've made inroads. Dr. Nixon from El Paso was probably one of the leaders in that movement in Texas to allow the African Americans the right to vote. And ironically, even though the Supreme Court sided with him, they had to side with him twice before Texas finally allowed the African Americans the right to vote with the freedoms that the Caucasians had. So it was very particular, very strange time. But we can read about it and go, never again.
Yeah, I recall in my intro to social work class with Dr. Mark Lusk at UTEP, we discussed about how, you mentioned about secession and how things happen differently in different parts of the state, but we also talk about how we're in the periphery when it comes to the state of Texas, right? We're at the very end, and even when people talk about West Texas, they think of Lubbock, Midland, Odessa. And I correct, yeah, exactly. I correct people saying there's still 6 hours left of the state. I guess one of the takeaways is also that people tend to forget that El Paso is part of Texas, right? People associate it more with southern New Mexico or even Mexico, period. And that we also tend to forget that it wasn't always an 80% Hispanic city, right? That it wasn't always a minority majority city, and that a lot of the issues, like you alluded to, that the rest of the country was enduring, in essence, also happened here in El Paso. And that on the flip side, some of the, I don't want to say solutions, but some of the change that occurred that turned us, over a new leaf per se, really did begin here in El Paso.
Yeah, a lot of it did. It's, I think that El Paso has been a great example historically to the progress that can be made when people just try to get along. Real quickly, I know we don't have a whole lot of time left in this one, but I was working with a program. It's going to be on PBS coming up soon, and it has to do with migration from Europe of the Jewish faith and how they were chased out of Spain and into Mexico, and then ultimately offered, if as long as they didn't practice their faith, they could stay there. Well, they obviously, being a strong Jewish faith, they didn't want to follow that line, so they started to migrate north, and that's how quite a few of them ended up in El Paso and Juarez, and ultimately became store owners, the Stewarts and the Schwartzes, those people there. That's how they ended up here. And there's several different 1 hour videos on the migration of the Jewish faith from Europe through Mexico into El Paso and up into New Mexico. And if you talk to some of the New Mexicans, they go, I wondered why we were lighting those candles on Christmas. I have no idea, because things have just diluted so much since the time that they came in.
Bernie, thank you very much. And that's a great way to end this particular segment, right? That in essence, the biggest takeaway is that just because El Paso, remind me, we celebrated our what birthday? We're at 175 years?
Más o menos, yeah.
Yeah, at about 175 years. That in our short life as a city, we've experienced quite a lot, right? And that we might forget that the city has experienced a lot of things. And we've really set a great foundation as to where we were, right? And so for our next episode, if you will all join us, we'll discuss how did all of this affect us, and how can all this turn into what impacts, what social issues are impacting our community now, and were they rooted in past issues? Have we progressed, and to what extent have we progressed? And so we'll touch on that at our next episode. I would like to thank Mr. Bernie Sargent for taking time out of his busy schedule for coming in today and providing his expertise. I would like to also thank you for letting us into your home and spending this time with us. For myself and the production crew here at El Paso Community College TV, thank you for your time. Remember, you can always access not only recordings from this show, previous shows, but the great programming that EPCC TV brings to you by accessing the EPCC TV YouTube channel. Any suggestions, comments, or suggestions for future shows, please feel free to email me. The address will appear momentarily. Again, remember, there's no harm in having difficult conversations about difficult issues. Simply keep it social.